Chapter 6, Tender Wings of Desire. He was tall, dressed like a sailor with a striped linen shirt and woolen pea coat crusted with sea salt. His hair was light and fair, framing his head in airy curls, and the eyes that stared back at her were almost the exact color of the sea, perhaps darker, but not by much, and they hid behind glasses with dark frames. Madeline had never seen a sailor wear glasses before. Somehow it made him seem all the more handsome. He leaned on the bar, his eyes looking into hers and liking what he saw. This wasn't like when Carson had appraised her. This was different. And for a moment she felt hot and cold at the same time. Madeline said. He smiled at her. The name's Harland. What's yours? His accent was one she had never heard before, sounding like a soft version of an American accent. Madeline. That is a beautiful name, Madeline, he said. You must be new here. Her mouth went dry as she tried desperately to figure out why this conversation was still happening. It was strange. It was not as though the other customers hadn't questioned her about her arrival. This felt different, though. This made her scramble for the proper words to say, something that would make her sound charming or clever, something that would make him want to speak to her more. She did not realize that all of her thinking and obsessing had been happening in real time. So she was mostly staring at him as she panicked, watching his face grow more and more amused as she struggled to find words that were charming enough. Finally, she just gave up. Yes, she replied, I am new here. Well, you are certainly a breath of fresh air. He was the most handsome person she had ever seen. Even his beard made him look even more manly than unkempt. I've never seen a sailor who wore glasses before, she said suddenly. He grinned. Neither have I. Then again, I don't often look in the mirror, he replied. She felt her cheeks blush a flame red, and she retreated to the kitchen to stop them from blushing further. In the kitchen she saw the cook, a scrawny boy who barely looked old enough to shave, let alone run a kitchen. He looked up from the pot of stew he was stirring. Upon seeing Madeline, he immediately started blushing. Sorry, ma'am, he said uselessly. Madeline opened her mouth, closed it again, and turned to leave the kitchen. Everything all right? Kiva asked as Madeline grabbed a towel and began to focus intently on wiping up a small spill of ale. Nothing, Madeline replied absently, not even realizing that she hadn't answered the question properly. Her mind was still full of his smile, those eyes. What was wrong with her? She barely knew who he was, and there he stood. She stood, acting like a silly schoolgirl. She managed to glance at him, only to realize that he had been looking at her as well. She gave a little sigh. Kiva followed her line of sight and chuckled. I see you've met Harland. Harland? Yes. That is what his name had been. Yes, Madeline said, all timid and horrible. She barely sounded like herself at this point. What was wrong with her? Harland's a regular. He goes out on the boats with the other sailors, but I think he's the only one who's really doing it for fun. This caught Madeline's attention. What do you mean? Kiva gave a little shrug. There's always been something about him that implied that he was having more fun than just making ends meet. Since he's here, I thought it was just his personality. That is a gift, isn't it? To be able to treat everything like a holiday, no matter what you are doing. I wish I had that. Madeline nodded, hoping that he was no longer looking at her. She snuck a little glance. He definitely still was. She looked away again. Kiva found all of this immensely entertaining. Isn't he a dish? I hadn't noticed, Madeline replied, not even bothering to pretend she wasn't lying. That only made Kiva laugh again and turn in his direction. Hey, Harland, she called over to him. Madeline was utterly mortified. Don't, she hissed at the woman she thought she was going to be her bosom friend. Harland looked over, his eyes still alluring, his smile still twinkling, and Madeline tried to keep her composure and not strangle Kiva where she stood. She decided that it would not be a good idea to strangle the woman who had given her a job. Madeline may not have been wise in the ways of the world, but she did not know that. Come over here, Kiva said to Harland. causing Madeline's heart to sink to the bottom of her rib cage in mortification. Perhaps, if she were lucky, she could just melt into the floor and stop existing. Even worse, Harlan stood up and walked down to the bar to sit in front of them. Although Kiva had called him over, he only seemed to have eyes for Madeline. This made her nervous, and to combat it, she smoothed her hair down, as if that movement would chase away the fluttering she felt in her stomach. "What would you like from me, Kiva?" he asked with his eyes sparkling. "I'm just asking you to be nice to our new worker," she said with a wink. "She's come a long way, dare I say. This may be her first job." Madeline wondered if it was possible to sink into the floor and disappear. Harlan leaned on the bar and looked at her with interest. "Is it? How old are you, lass?" His accent definitely sounded too cultured for an American farmer, and being a sailor meant that he wasn't a member of the gentry. Did they have gentry in America? Did it matter as much as it did here? Madeline was finally beginning to regain a little of the composure she had lost when she first laid eyes on the man. Finally, she felt some measure of who she was returning, and it gave her enough strength to look into his eyes. "Old enough," she replied daringly. He laughed. "A grown woman who has never worked a day in her life? You must have had quite the upbringing." "Clearly, I did not if I ran away from it," Madeline replied a little too easily. Immediately, she regretted it. She did not want to give away her entire backstory to this near stranger, no matter how handsome he was. His smile grew slowly again, and her heart began to beat faster. Was she getting sick? It was the only explanation that made sense. Good point. Kiva decided to take pity on poor Madeline and sent her to collect some empty tankards that had been left at various tables. Madeline gave Kiva a look of pathetic thanks and went off to do her job, but as she left, she heard Harlan's slow chuckle. "You better behave," Kiva admonished him. "On the contrary," Madeline heard Harlan reply, "I think behaving is the last thing I want to do with her." In any other context, Madeline would be disgusted. Who did he think he was, saying such things about her within earshot? However, as she walked away, she could not help but feel a slow burn deep in her belly, and she wondered what it meant. That night, when the tavern had closed and the two women worked together to clean the bar, Madeline tried desperately to focus more on mopping the floor than on the look in Harlan's eyes when he watched her from across the room. Kiva looked over at her and gave a little chuckle. "What's gotten into you?" she asked. "I do not know you very well, of course, but I'm fairly certain you are not acting like yourself." Madeline shook her head, pausing her mopping. "I do not know, but I think that I am falling ill or something of the sort. Earlier I felt all hot and cold. Perhaps all this traveling has caught up with me." Kiva did not look convinced, but she did look amused, and she leaned on the bar and gave a little grin. "Oh? Tell me more about this mysterious illness that has suddenly befallen you." Madeline gave a deep sigh that sounded far more dramatic than she felt. "My heart and my head. And when I looked at—" She cut herself off, thinking about Harlan and his stupid, terrible, handsome face. Kiva looked fit to burst with laughter. "Looks like you are in love." Given everything she believed about herself, this shocked Madeline to the core, and she shook her head wildly, her chocolate brown curls bouncing over her shoulders. "It is not like that at all," she insisted. "How could I love him? I do not even know him." "Do you think he's handsome?" "A blind person would think he's handsome." More laughter. "Does your heart go a-flutter when you look at him?" Madeline snorted. "Do not be ridiculous. I've only seen him for one night." "You know," Kiva said, "he seemed rather taken with you as well." Madeline's heart did a little dance of fear, excitement, and some other emotion that she could not name. She could feel her cheeks reddening, and it made her feel utterly foolish to care so much about a person whose last name she did not even know. "Well," she replied, "that's something." Truly, she did not know what to say, and under Kiva's knowing grin, she felt as though she might suffocate. The two of them exited the front of the tavern with the intention of walking around the side, mounting the stairs, and heading to bed. As they did so, Kiva's face grew a little sheepish. "It is nothing fancy, but you can have a room all to yourself if you are inclined. I am the only one who lives up here." Another lady did once, but she did not last long. She ran off with a sailor a year or two back, and it is only now that we've finally gotten around to replacing her. Madeline did not understand why, but there was a tone in Kiva's voice that implied that she was ashamed of where she lived, and as she opened the door to the small house above the tavern, Madeline could not see why. There was a homey little sitting room and a bedroom or two just off of it. It was clean and respectable, and Madeline fell in love with it immediately. "It is perfect," she breathed. Kiva looked away so as to not show her facial expression, which was a mixture of relief and embarrassment over having been worried at all. "Your room is this way," she said, heading down to the end of the hall. Madeline followed, excited to be sleeping in a bed that she could call hers, and trying to forget the fact that no matter how much she had tried to shed her image of coming from wealth, it seemed as though it followed her anyway. Her new bedroom was small, far from the large, sumptuous room that she had fled just days before. It was a little dusty, having not been occupied in a while, but the bed looked clean, with a straw-stuffed mattress covered by a little homemade quilt. Madeline walked over and touched it, feeling the softness of the thing and loving it intensely, even though it was the first quilt she had ever seen. Kiva looked sheepish. "That is one of mine," she explained. "I had an extra one, so I put it here for the next person, who I suppose is you." The moment of tenderness passed rather quickly from Kiva's face, and she brushed her hair out of her eyes. Suddenly she looked very tired, and Madeline did not blame her. An ache had begun to seep into her bones. As Madeline set her travel bag down on the bed, Kiva became all business. "I usually make breakfast in the mornings. Carson would never eat otherwise, and that cook does not know his way around much." "I never learned his name," Madeline said, as it began to dawn on her. "The boy? Liam. Carson found him wandering around one day, figured he could make himself useful somewhere, but I suppose we haven't found out where yet. He's a good boy, but if he could ever get the courage to speak. I'm talking too much. You must be exhausted." Madeline was about to tell her that it was fine. She wasn't too tired, but whatever she might have said was soon followed up by a yawn. Kiva smiled and shook her head. "You did well tonight, and I think you'll be well suited for this, but I do want to give you a little measure of warning." "Oh?" Kiva's smile turned a little sad then. "Men like Harlan are handsome, and they say such lovely things to a pretty lady, especially a new pretty woman as innocent as you." Madeline wanted to protest, to say that she wasn't innocent at all, not in the least, but she bit back her words because, in all honesty, she was pretty innocent, no matter how much she did not want to be. There was something in Kiva's expression that gave Madeline pause, however. She narrowed her eyes, studying Kiva's face and its look of discomfort. A question began to form in Madeline's head. One she wasn't sure she wanted to ask, but also did not think she could not ask this woman, who clearly knew more about the world. "Kiva," Madeline chewed on the words she wanted to say, unsure of whether or not she would offend the other woman by asking at all. Kiva's dark eyes looked fierce for a moment, as though she knew what was coming, but she allowed it to come anyway. "It wasn't Harlan, if that's what you're going to ask," she said, answering the question for Madeline before she could even form it. "But I've known men like him. All women like me know men like him." "What's a woman like you?" Madeline asked without thinking. Kiva looked very sad then. "Not a grand woman, like you are probably going to end up being," she replied. "One day I hope you'll explain what happened to have brought you to a place like this." Madeline wanted to protest again, but Kiva had already turned on her heel and disappeared out of her bedroom. She sat on the bed, thinking about who she was and who she could be, desperately hoping that she would actually become the person she wanted to become, and fearful that the person she once was would always be hanging over her head. It stayed on her mind as she crawled into bed. It was not nearly as comfortable as the feather-stuffed mattress she had grown up using, but it was hers, and for some reason that made her treasure it all the more. All she had to do, she decided, was not think about that Harlan, no matter how much she wanted to.